Imagine you're lying on a straw mattress in a dim, smoky room. The air is thick with the scent of unwashed bodies, stale ale, and the sharp, coppery smell of blood. You have a raging fever, your skin is pale and clammy, and every breath is a struggle. A man in a rough wool robe, his hands stained and calloused, leans over you. In his hand he holds a rusty, uncleaned blade, its edge dull and glinting in the weak light. This is not a nightmare. This is medicine in the Middle Ages. And the truth about what passed for healing in those times is far worse and more complex than you've ever imagined. It's a world where the line between a healer and a butcher was often impossibly thin. The year is 1347. You are not in a sterile modern hospital. You are in a world where disease is seen as a punishment from God or an imbalance in the cosmos. The Black Death, a plague of unimaginable horror, is just beginning its slow, unstoppable march across Europe. In villages and towns, fear and superstition completely replace science. Knowledge is scarce and often guarded, passed down through generations of healers, monks, and barbers. Doctors, if you can call them that, sometimes wear long, beaked leather masks stuffed with aromatic herbs like lavender, mint, and cloves, believing that the smell will ward off the deadly miasma or bad air they think is carrying the disease. Hospitals exist, but they are nothing like our modern facilities. They are mostly run by monasteries and charitable orders, and their purpose is less about curing the sick and more about providing comfort to the dying. They are places of prayer and palliative care, where a priest might be a more common sight than a physician. To live in the medieval world is to live in a constant gamble with death. A simple cut can turn gangrenous. A broken bone can lead to a fatal infection. And the cures you might receive for a minor ailment, they could be as deadly as the illness itself. The world of medieval medicine is not a world of hope, but a world of chance and desperate, gruesome measures. We think of modern medicine as a path to recovery, a systematic and scientific approach to the human body. But in the Middle Ages, it was a bewildering mix of guesswork, ancient theories, religious ritual, and outright torture. The treatments we find shocking today, bloodletting, applying boiling herbs, cauterizing wounds with fire, and even trepanation, or drilling holes into the skull, were all part of a physician's toolkit. They did it all, and they did it with a straight face. But here's the core question we need to answer. Were medieval doctors really just ignorant, superstitious fools with no real understanding of the human body? Or did they know exactly what they were doing, just with the wrong tools, flawed theories, and a desperate hope for a cure? The answer is not as simple as we think. It will challenge your assumptions and change the way you see history. We're not here to mock them, but to understand the terrifying reality they faced. In the next few minutes, we're going to step into the dark and often bizarre world of medieval healing. We will examine their most shocking treatments and the ancient, flawed theories behind them. We will look at the tools they used, from simple knives to gruesome contraptions. We'll even explore the rare cases where their methods, by pure chance, actually worked, and why those successes reinforced their flawed beliefs. By the end of this journey, you'll understand why medieval medicine was as much about faith, fear, and power as it was about the human body. We'll explore the complex relationship between doctors, the church, and the public, and how this dynamic shaped every aspect of healthcare. You'll be left with a newfound appreciation for the modern world and the long, painful road humanity took to get here. To understand medieval medicine, you have to start with its foundation, a theory from ancient Greece that dominated medical thought for over 1,000 years. This was the theory of the four humors. It was the cornerstone of their entire medical system, and it was a masterpiece of logical deduction based on faulty premises. The theory was most famously championed by the Greek physician Galen and his predecessor, Hippocrates. They believed the human body was governed by 4 essential fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each of these humors was associated with a specific organ, a season, and even a personality trait. Blood was linked to the heart and spring. It made a person sanguine or cheerful. Phlegm was tied to the brain in winter, making someone phlegmatic or calm. Yellow bile from the liver was associated with summer and made a person choleric or angry. And finally, black bile from the spleen was tied to autumn and made a person melancholic or sad. Illness, according to this theory, was not caused by germs or genetics. It was caused by a simple problem. Your humors were out of balance. A fever meant you had too much blood. A cold meant you had too much phlegm. The goal of every medieval physician was not to cure the illness, but to restore this delicate balance. And the cure? Restore balance, often in brutal ways. If you had a fever, they might decide you had an excess of blood, and therefore prescribe bloodletting. If you were lethargic, they might purge your stomach to get rid of what they believed was an excess of phlegm. If you were aggressive, they might prescribe herbs to reduce your yellow bile. And yes, this was considered cutting-edge science for over 1,000 years. Without any knowledge of anatomy, microbiology, or chemistry, this theory provided a neat, albeit horribly wrong, framework for understanding every ailment known to man. Of all the gruesome treatments, none were more common or more deadly than bloodletting. It was the go-to solution for almost every ailment imaginable, from headaches to pneumonia, fevers to childbirth complications. The logic was simple. If an excess of a humor was making you sick, remove it. And since blood was the most visible and easily removed humor, it was always the first to go. Doctors and barbers used a variety of terrifying tools for this procedure. They had knives or lancets that they would simply slice into a vein. They used a special instrument called a phleem, a small blade with a point that could be driven into a vein with a small mallet. And for those who had a deeper fear of the knife, there was the leech. Leeches were placed on the skin and allowed to suck blood until they were full. The practice was so popular that people would often do it preventatively, believing that a regular bloodletting would keep them healthy. In small amounts, it sometimes, by sheer coincidence, relieved pressure from certain conditions, like a headache from high blood pressure. But without any knowledge of infection, blood volume, or the sterile instruments required, the practice was a ticking time bomb. A cut from a rusty, dirty knife could introduce deadly bacteria. Draining too much blood could cause a patient to go into shock and die outright. It was a gamble. And yet, this practice was so ingrained in the medical world that it was trusted by everyone from kings and queens to the poorest peasants. Even popes and religious figures were known to get bled regularly. The sheer weight of tradition and the lack of a better alternative meant that a practice that likely killed more people than it saved was considered the pinnacle of medical wisdom for centuries. Imagine needing surgery in the 14th century. There's no anesthesia. There's no antiseptic. The operating room is a dimly lit, dirty workshop. Your surgeon, often a barber by trade, identified by the distinctive red and white stripes of their pole, symbolizing blood and bandages, relies on one thing above all else: speed. The longer you're on the table, the more likely you are to die from shock, blood loss, or infection. For a broken arm, they would set it with wooden splints and linen strips, a relatively straightforward procedure. But for more severe injuries, things got much more grim. An arrow wound, for example, required the surgeon to dig the arrowhead out with iron tongs that were often heated in a fire. The logic was that the heat would cauterize the wound and stop the bleeding. But the pain would have been unbearable. And if an infection set in, the treatment was just as horrific. They would cauterize the wound with a red-hot metal rod, burning the flesh to kill the poison and stop its spread. This was seen as a necessary evil, and it did sometimes prevent the spread of infection. But again, it was a torturous experience. Surviving the initial surgery was only half the battle. Surviving the weeks afterward, when the wound would inevitably become infected with the germs from the unsterile tools and dirty environment, was far less certain. The patient would have a high fever, the wound would begin to smell, and in most cases, death was a grim certainty. The success of medieval surgery was a testament to the sheer resilience of the human body, not the skill of the surgeon. One of the oldest and most terrifying surgical procedures was trepanation, the act of drilling a hole into the skull. It sounds like something from a horror movie, but archaeological evidence suggests that this practice dates back to prehistoric times. In the Middle Ages, the reasons for performing it were just as chilling. Sometimes it was done for head trauma, to relieve pressure on the brain from a swelling or a blood clot. Other times it was done for a much more mystical reason, to release evil spirits that were believed to be causing everything from seizures to mental illness and headaches. The logic was that if a demon was trapped inside your head, the only way to get it out was to give it a way to escape. The tools were crude and brutal: a flint knife, a metal drill, or a saw. A physician would scrape away the skin, then use a hand-powered drill to bore a hole straight through the patient's skull. Remarkably, archaeological evidence shows that some patients did survive this procedure. We know this because the bone around the hole shows signs of new growth, which only happens if the patient lived for months or years after the surgery. But without sterile tools, it was an open invitation for a fatal infection. And yet, the idea of trepanation persisted, because in a world without brain scans or antibiotics, sometimes this crude method did save lives by sheer dumb luck. A patient who happened to have a blood clot on the brain from an injury might have their life saved by the pressure being relieved. It was a lottery, and the odds were stacked against you. When the Black Death arrived in Europe, medicine descended into chaos. The plague was a force of nature that no one understood. The theory of the four humors was useless against it. Doctors were dying just as fast as their patients. In this environment of total fear, medicine became an even more desperate mix of superstition, religion, and bizarre, untested theories. Some doctors clung to the idea that the plague was caused by miasma, bad air. They prescribed carrying fragrant flowers, burning incense, or bathing in vinegar to cleanse the air and your body. The beak masks we talked about earlier were part of this theory. They believed the herbs in the beak would purify the air they breathed. Others, however, recommended far more extreme and stomach-turning measures. Some doctors suggested bathing in urine, which was believed to have cleansing properties. Others recommended applying poultices made from crushed emeralds, believing that their magical properties would draw out the disease. Still, others recommended cutting open the painful, swollen lymph nodes, the buboes, that were a hallmark of the disease, to drain the poison. This was an agonizing procedure that often did nothing but spread the infection. Nothing worked. The real cause of the plague, Yersinia pestis, a bacteria carried by fleas on rats, was centuries away from being discovered. The medieval doctors were fighting an invisible enemy with sticks and stones. Medicine in the Middle Ages was inseparable from religion. Illness was often seen as divine punishment for sin. This belief meant that the first line of defense against any disease was not a physician, but a priest. Prayer, confession, pilgrimages to holy sites, and the veneration of relics from saints were all prescribed as cures. People believed that if their faith was strong enough, God would heal them. Monks, in particular, played a huge role in medicine. They copied ancient medical texts by hand, often in the scriptoriums of monasteries. This painstaking work helped to preserve the knowledge of the ancient Greeks and Romans, blending it with Christian belief. In some cases, this helped to preserve valuable knowledge for future generations. In others, it delayed scientific progress because questioning the Church's medical teachings could be seen as heresy. To challenge the idea that illness was a divine punishment was to challenge the authority of the Church, a crime that could be punishable by death. It wasn't all horror and superstition. There was a good side to medieval medicine, and it came from the natural world. Medieval herbal medicine sometimes worked, and it was often practiced by women, herbalists, and midwives who were closer to the folk traditions of healing. They were not doctors in the formal sense, but they had a deep, intuitive knowledge of plants. Willow bark, for example, was a common remedy for pain and fever. We now know that willow bark contains a natural chemical called salicin, a close relative of aspirin. Garlic, honey, and certain molds were also used in poultices and potions, and we now know that all of these have natural antibacterial or antibiotic properties. These herbalists and midwives often provided care that was far more effective than the formal physicians of the time, especially for common ailments. They were also the main source of care for women during childbirth, a time when physicians rarely got involved. Their knowledge was passed down through generations, and it was a small bright spot in a world of otherwise dangerous and ineffective cures. But alongside these useful remedies came outright quackery and superstition. The fear and desperation of the time meant that people would try anything. Doctors might hang an amulet around a patient's neck to ward off illness, believing it had a magical property. Others might recommend carrying a dead toad in a pouch, a bizarre ritual believed to prevent plague. And in a practice that is both fascinating and deeply disturbing, some even suggested drinking powdered mummy. Yes, actual ground-up human remains, believing it had special healing properties. Many believed that astrology could predict disease, and that the alignment of the stars and planets could affect a person's health. Your treatment might depend not on your symptoms, but on your zodiac sign and the position of the stars. It was a world where science, religion, and magic were all hopelessly intertwined. It's easy for us, with our modern understanding of germ theory, antibiotics, and sterile surgery, to see medieval medicine as foolish and its practitioners as ignorant. But remember, without microscopes, germ theory, or modern chemistry, they were working blind. They could not see the bacteria or viruses that were causing the diseases. They had no way of knowing that a clean knife was better than a dirty one. And in some cases, their treatments were logical, based on the information they had. Bloodletting was a reasonable conclusion to draw from a theory that said too much blood caused a fever. Cauterizing a wound with a hot iron made sense as a way to stop a dangerous spread of poison or rot. The real horror isn't that they were stupid, it's that they were doing their very best with the most limited, flawed, and terrifying knowledge. They were not fools, they were dedicated, and often desperate, men and women trying to make sense of a world that was constantly trying to kill them. They were doing the best they could, and it was still, tragically, not enough. Picture this. You're a blacksmith in the year 1362. A good life, but a hard one. You fall ill with a fever, a racking cough, and an overwhelming weakness. Your wife, worried sick, calls for the town's physician, who is also the local barber. He arrives, a grim expression on his face. He examines you, checks your pulse, and declares your humor's unbalanced. He prescribes bloodletting. He uses a phlegm to make a small cut in your arm, and a basin slowly fills with your blood. You feel even weaker afterward, and the fever remains. He returns a day later with a poultice of herbs, a mixture of strange-smelling plants and honey. He applies it to your chest. The fever rises higher. Your breathing becomes more shallow. In desperation, your family moves you to the local monastery, where monks pray over you and offer a bitter herbal drink. Days later, you either recover by sheer chance, your immune system finally winning the battle, or you're buried in the churchyard. That was medicine. That was reality. The line between being saved by a cure and killed by it was often a matter of pure luck. Medieval medicine was brutal, strange, and often deadly. But it was also a vital, if flawed, step on the path to modern science. From the monastery's preservation of texts to the trial and error of herbalists, each small step, however misguided, paved the way toward our modern understanding of the body. They gave us the first universities, the first dissections of bodies, and the first attempts to separate medicine from pure superstition. And perhaps the most horrifying truth isn't the bloodletting, the trepanation, or the plague cures. It's that for centuries, for thousands upon thousands of people, this was the best humanity could do. It was a world where healing was a desperate act, and survival was a miracle. It reminds us that progress is not a given, but a long, hard-fought battle against ignorance and chance. So, would you have survived medieval medicine? Or would the cure have been worse than the disease? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more true stories from history's darkest corners, subscribe and hit the notification bell, because the past is never as distant as we think.
If history leaves you curious and craving more, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Join us on the journey through time, one forgotten echo at a time.